US maintains 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Canada responds forcefully. The trade war between the United States and Canada, two neighboring nations with historically intertwined economies, has entered a new phase of escalation as the US continues to impose 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada. This is not the first time the administration of Donald Trump has wielded tariffs as a tool to pressure trade partners, but this time, Canada has struck back with retaliatory tariffs worth $2.7 billion, targeting a wide range of American products. These measures have significantly impacted industries such as automotive manufacturing, consumer goods, and energy. What are the consequences? Rising car prices, billions in losses for the US coal industry, and severe disruptions to global supply chains. Who will suffer more, Canada or the US? Beyond tariffs, Canada has also rolled out smart, multi-level economic strategies to counter the US moves. Meanwhile, Trump's shocking statements about annexing Canada and seizing Greenland have added fuel to the fire. Are these serious plans or mere political theater? I will provide a detailed analysis of this trade conflict, exploring Canada's countermeasures, the fallout for US industries like automotive and coal, and the long-term implications for both economies. I will also assess Canada's strategies to safeguard its national interests and unpack the true meaning behind Trump's controversial rhetoric. Canada's smart countermeasures, facing the US's 25% tariffs on its steel and aluminum. The Canadian federal government, led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau or a potential successor like Mark Carney, depending on the political landscape in March 2025, has refused to back down. Instead, Ottawa has launched retaliatory tariffs worth $2.7 billion targeting key US exports, signaling unequivocally that Canada will not bow to economic pressure from Washington. These measures extend beyond the federal level, with provinces stepping up to bolster a multi-tiered strategy that protects Canadian interests while pressuring the US federal retaliatory tariffs, a direct hit on US businesses. Canada has imposed 25% tariffs on American steel and aluminum, inflicting an estimated $1.1 billion in damages on US metal industry businesses. This is a direct counterstrike, as the US not only imports vast quantities of steel and aluminum from Canada, but also exports significant amounts of metal products northward. According to the American Iron and Steel Institute, AISI, Canada supplied 5.95 million tons of steel to the US in 2024, while the US exported roughly 2 million tons to Canada annually. By imposing tariffs on US steel and aluminum, Canada has raised costs for its own manufacturers reliant on American materials, while simultaneously pressuring US steel companies that depend on the Canadian market. Beyond metals, Canada expanded its retaliatory tariffs to include consumer and industrial goods, such as sporting equipment, computers, electronics, and household appliances, affecting $1.6 billion in US exports. Products like Dell computers, Apple phones, and Whirlpool appliances now face a 25% tariff upon entering Canada, driving up retail prices and eroding the competitiveness of American brands in the Canadian market. This impacts US corporate revenues and Canadian consumers alike, who now pay more for familiar goods. However, Ottawa has calculated that this short-term pain is a necessary trade-off to exert economic pressure on the US and force a reconsideration of its tariff policies. Provincial action, localized strategies. A standout feature of Canada's response is the active involvement of its provinces, which wield significant autonomy within the federal system. Major provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta have implemented tailored policies to support the national strategy, protecting local interests while amplifying pressure on the US. Ontario, Canada's most populous province and economic hub, has banned the sale of American liquor in its government-managed retail system. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario, LCBO. Iconic US whiskey brands like Jack Daniel's and Jim Beam, hugely popular in Canada, are no longer available through Ontario's official retail channels. This directly cuts into the revenues of American liquor producers, for whom Canada is the second largest export market after Mexico. Estimates suggest the US whiskey industry could lose $200–300 million annually in Ontario alone. Premier Doug Ford, a conservative with a hardline stance, has called this a necessary response to protect Canadian jobs and industries against the US's unreasonable tariffs. In Quebec, the provincial government has shifted public procurement policies to favor domestic or non-US suppliers. Government contracts, ranging from infrastructure projects to medical equipment purchases, now prioritize Canadian firms or partners from the European Union, EU. This reduces reliance on American goods while boosting Quebec's domestic industries, notably aerospace, Bombardier, and aluminum production, Rio Tinto. The move signals to the US that Canada is prepared to seek alternative suppliers if the trade war persists. Alberta, Canada's energy heartland, has taken a different tack by diversifying its supply chains. Rather than relying on the US for industrial equipment and raw materials, Alberta is pivoting to imports from the EU, Japan, and South Korea. For instance, oil and gas companies in Alberta now prefer steel pipes from South Korea over the US, leveraging Canada's membership in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. This not only cuts long-term costs but also weakens the US's position as a dominant supplier in North America. Long-term goal: reducing dependence on the US. On a broader scale, Canada's countermeasures aim not just to inflict economic pain on the US, but to pursue a strategic long-term goal: reducing reliance on the American market. For decades, the US has been Canada's largest trading partner, accounting for about 75% of Canada's exports, based on 2024 data. Yet this dependence has left Canada vulnerable to US protectionism, like the current 25% tariffs. Through retaliatory tariffs and supply chain diversification, Canada is gradually building a more self-reliant economy, better equipped to weather disruptions from south of the border. Can the US withstand this pressure? That depends on the Trump administration's patience and the ability of American businesses to adapt to shifting global supply chains. What's clear is that Canada isn't merely reacting, it's proactively shaping the battlefield, forcing the US to grapple with significant economic consequences. US auto industry in turmoil, a domino effect from tariffs. The US automotive industry, a cornerstone of the American economy, is reeling from the 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. With Canada supplying roughly 80% of the steel and aluminum used in US car manufacturing, rising material costs have triggered a domino effect, driving up vehicle prices, straining manufacturers, and threatening tens of thousands of jobs in production hubs like Detroit. Rising material costs, a burden on manufacturers. Steel and aluminum are the lifeblood of automotive production, making up about 50% of an average vehicle's weight. According to the Alliance for Automotive Manufacturers, AAM, Canada provided 56% of US aluminum imports and 58% of steel imports in 2024. The 25% tariffs have sharply increased production costs for American automakers. For example, the Ford F-150, the best-selling pickup truck in the US, could see its price rise by $400–600 per unit due to higher steel and aluminum costs. With millions of F-150s sold annually, Ford faces an additional $1.2 billion in yearly costs if the tariffs persist. General Motors, GM, another industry titan, isn't spared either. GM anticipates an extra $800 million in annual production costs, largely due to soaring aluminum prices. Tesla, the leading electric vehicle maker, faces even steeper challenges given its heavy reliance on aluminum for models like the Tesla Model 3 and Model Y. Rising aluminum costs could push Tesla's vehicle prices up by $1,000 each, undermining its edge over Chinese competitors like BYD. Ripple effects. From factories to consumers, the tariffs' impact extends beyond manufacturers to the entire automotive supply chain. Smaller component suppliers, a critical part of the industry, are also grappling with higher material costs, forcing them to raise prices for major automakers like Ford and GM. This creates a cost spiral that ultimately lands on American consumers. If the trade war drags on through 2025, the average US vehicle price could rise by 5 to 10%, or $2,000 to $4,000 per car, according to the Center for Automotive Research, KIAR. The fallout isn't just about prices. Higher costs could dampen US car demand, especially as inflation remains a lingering concern. This threatens production levels at American factories, which have already trimmed jobs in recent years to cut costs. In Detroit, the Motor City, over 10,000 jobs are at risk if automakers scale back output. Workers there, many from the middle class, will bear the brunt of a tariff policy Trump claims is meant to protect American jobs. An economic paradox. Ironically, Trump's tariffs, touted as a shield for the US steel and aluminum industries, are harming a far larger sector: automotive manufacturing. The US Department of Commerce reports that the auto industry contributes about 3% to US GDP, roughly $700 billion annually. while steel and aluminum account for less than 0.5%. Sacrificing the auto sector to prop up steel seems a questionable economic trade-off, especially since domestic U.S. steel producers lack the capacity to fully replace Canadian imports in the short term. The U.S. auto industry is in turmoil, and American consumers will soon feel the pinch through higher car prices. If trade tensions persist, the U.S. economy could face a mild recession by 2026, with the auto sector at the epicenter of this economic storm.